Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here on our live stream webinar, all about being legally MMC. And today our webinar is all about how traditional contract models really were not designed with MMC in mind. So we're going to pick apart some of the kind of legal contracts and the ideas around how we transition to a more MMC mind, because some of these technicalities, some of these things around forming legal contracts can be a real barrier to using MMC, or certainly can be a perceived barrier to delivering new MMC housing. And so in this webinar, which we're live streaming for you, you're going to hear from various different lawyers and experts in this arena who are paving the way for new contracting models and ways of allocating risk that are better suited to MMC. And we're going to talk about and unpack a little bit more about the opportunities and the challenges in this field. We have some amazing speakers that I'm really delighted to introduce you to in a moment, and I'm going to let them do their introductions because I'll butcher it, let's be honest. So let's let them do a really good job of introducing themselves. But before I hand over to each of our panelists, I just want to give you a little bit more context for this webinar today. So this is part of a series called Workforce for the Future that is being pulled together in partnership with YTKO, Bristol Housing Festival and MOBI. And the aim is to look at how SMEs can engage more with MMC. So my name's Jessie Wild and I'm one of the directors of the Bristol Housing Festival. And we've been working with these different partners on this Workforce for the Future project, particularly pulling together things like site visits, MMC site visits around the city of Bristol, and other events that we know will speak into and bring expertise together to talk about how SMEs can engage with modern methods of construction, to basically look at upskilling the workforce and make sure that we have the knowledge readily available out there to start to kind of address this sort of change in mindset to MMC. Now, we know that actually we have a climate crisis, we have an ecology crisis, we have a skills shortage in the construction industry, we have a housing crisis, whether that's affordability, suitability, what have you. And all these crises and all these challenges sort of interweave one with another and make for quite a complex challenge that we are facing currently when it comes to home building. We also know that MMC is not some magic silver bullet that's going to come along and solve all of our problems. However, it is a real opportunity in which to tackle some of the challenges and the complexities that we're facing at the moment. MMC offers a step change in the way that we're delivering homes. It forces us to ask bigger and more overarching holistic questions about the models that we are building our homes on and how we're going to change those going forward. So one of our key priorities is to celebrate good news stories, is to champion lessons that are being learned, and to set good examples for what can be achieved when people collaborate, when people think innovatively and differently, and all that kind of thing. So this webinar, as I've mentioned, is part of the series with the Workforce for Future. And if you're interested in any of the other webinars that have been before so far, do check out our YouTube channel or look at the Bristol Housing Festival website or the YTKO website as well. On those two websites, you'll also find all the events coming up in the future. There are some in-person events where you can start to learn more about this project. There are some more site visits coming up as well, and there'll be more things that will be announced in the coming months. Really, the point of this programme and the funding that's behind it is to make sure that SMEs, small and medium enterprises within the construction industry, within the West of England region, have the opportunity to learn more about MMC. And there is even some funding available and some training courses that are available as part of that. So please do get in touch if that's you, if that's of interest, if that's something you want to learn more about. Please do visit the YTKO website and look for the Workforce for the Future package, or get in touch with us directly and to learn more. Right, that's enough from me. That is the spiel, that is the introduction. But what I'm going to do is hand over to our speakers each in turn. We're going to go to Alan first, and then we're going to go on to Rehan, on to Josh, then Surya and Saya, and I will let them introduce themselves, explain who they are, what organisation they work for, and they're going to tell us a little bit about this in this arena, how these things overlap with things like the low carbon agenda, how drawing together contracts, enable MMC to go forward, some of the opportunities and the challenges that we faces. And we're also going to hear about some case studies of where that has happened as well going forward. So I'm going to hand to those in person. I'm going to try to stay well out of it. So please do just hand from one person to the other. The only time I'm going to, panelists, the only time I'm going to interrupt is if you start running over by miles, in which case I'll curtail you and move us on to the next person so we can get to some of the questions that we have ready to go. So Alan, over to you. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks so much, Jessie. So by way of introduction, my name is Alan Tate. I'm a partner at Sisters Mitchell Moores LLP, based mainly in Bristol, Exeter and London. So our journey on modern methods of construction started at least 5 years ago. We helped draft a booklet which is published by Constructing Excellence Southwest, about off-site modular construction. So that's where we kind of first started. We tend to act for the employer side and focused on volumetric systems of modern methods construction. So that's really where I'm coming from. We've acted for, on a few projects. We've acted for a well-known registered provider in the Southwest using the Southwest Procurement Alliance, where they've set up a framework with a off-site modular manufacturer, and I think most people would know the name of it, but I can't say who it is. And also we advised Bristol City Council on the project which Jessie's already mentioned, Hope Rise, and Rianne's also going to talk about later on, so we were involved in that project as well. I think the takeaway point from my perspective is that all contracts can be drafted to reflect the agreed commercial arrangements between parties, and that's no different in the MMC. Of course, naively, we can all just think that all you do for MMC is go to a manufacturer, order 50 units, and they get supplied and delivered. But the construction industry isn't quite like that, I'm afraid. We like to change things. We have planning constraints. We like to specify, and we like to change what we thought we wanted in the first place, and that's quite a difficult area for NMC. So it's a different relationship with manufacturers doing MMC. It's a relationship of cooperation and one of development. So it tends to be a long-term relationship rather than a one-off project. So that's most of the contracts that we've been involved in. From a construction perspective, I think it's fair to say that most manufacturers of MMC are relatively new within the construction sector, and they're still learning about CDM regs and all those kind of things on site, as it were. But from the manufacturer's perspective, I think that they're having to teach the construction industry a few things in the commercial world. They need things like design freeze dates. They need to know what they're going to put through the factory by a certain date. We also need to talk about advanced payment arrangements. That's something we need to put in the contract as well. Ownership of undelivered materials and units. We need to think about that. Copyrighting designs. Who should retain the copyright? Should the client be entitled to take that design and give it to another manufacturer, or should another manufacturer offer it to another client? So things like that to think about. Lead-in times. The factory line always has to be working hard, and so it's so important for the manufacturer to program in when they can produce these units, because that factory is an expensive asset. Also things like inspection processes when the unit is finished off the factory line, and the BOPAS accreditation. These are all things that we can probably talk about a bit later on. And then, of course, the manufacturer has to deal with delivery, unloading risks, and insurances, something else we have to look at from a legal perspective. And then there's the actual on-site process, the manufacturer coming onto site and actually assembling the unit and the attendances that they require, and also who's going to produce the kind of services to that unit and the infrastructure. So these are all things which have a slightly different perspective when you're talking about MMC. And so these are my kind of topics for conversation, I think, Jessie, later on. So that's me. So I think it's over to Rehan now.
Hi there, hopefully you can hear me. So yeah, thank you very much. And again, sort of coming from the practical boots on the ground type experience of working from the contracts as well. So I'm Dr. Rehan Kodabakis. I'm the Operations and Technical Director at ZPODS, and we delivered Hope Rise in conjunction with Bristol's Council and Bristol Housing Festival, and worked with Alan on the original contract side of it. I think what we worked out quite early on was that there was a few holes in the contracts, or the standard JCT contracts, that when you're working with modular didn't really quite work. Because we're doing offsite volumetric, they included things like how do you marry procurement with the fact that things like vesting certificates, so if you're vesting in windows and other items, they'll be in our factory rather than being on site. And that sort of created some more legal issues around where those items actually stood and how do you correctly vest them. Other things as well is, we're acting as principal contractors, so we're delivering things like all the on-site works as well as the off-site works. So how do you then liaise and make sure that you've got payments that reflect almost a monthly valuation side of on-site work, but also there's more stage payments and periodic valuations that you get within the off-site and the factory elements. And that sort of creates how do you balance all of this together, and how do you make sure that you treat things? And as part of our journey, we've sort of looked at moving the perception, if you like, of a factory to actually being, consider it as a site. This is just a site that's in our factory that's not moving, and treat it as part of you would do as a traditional site. And therefore you can come and inspect when you want to, you can come do your evaluations when you want to, look at your advanced procured materials. And by sort of looking at that, it then makes it easier when especially when you have multiple projects running at one time. It brings it more into the realm of sort of financial stability in terms of cash flowing multiple projects rather than just one project at a time. And then it's very interesting what Anna was saying about establishing copyright, and how do we do that under either a pre-contract service agreement or within the main contract, because copyright is quite key to what we do, especially when we've been pioneering at the sort of cutting and bleeding edge of net zero carbon design, to make sure that that's protected, but also that the client gets what they need to be able to look and manage and operate from a facilities management side, the building at the end of it. I think one of the key questions that we've looked at recently is actually where does REBA Stage 4 actually sit, because it falls out of a pre-service contract agreement, but creates some issues with sort of heading into a fixed price JCT at the other end. And that should we really be looking at that pre-contract service agreement to include that REBA Stage 4, so you get the full tender pack, so therefore you don't get too many provisional sums when you move to either a second stage tender or a fixed price JCT. And then it's quite key, and at what point do we get to the design freeze to involve and remove too many variations within the price after that. So I think this is sort of quite a bit of a flavour of what we've experienced and what we've done and experienced on site, and how we're delivering our contracts at the moment. I'll pass back to the moderators.
Thanks so much, Rehan. We're going to move on to Josh.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rehan. Thanks, Jessie. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm the keen bean today with slides, so I'll just set that up. Brilliant. Hopefully you can all see my first slide there. Great, thank you. So hi everyone, it's great to be able to join this discussion today. I'm Josh, I'm a project associate at the Chancery Lane project, or TCLP for short. I have a background in corporate law, and as part of that I spent some time in-house at an oil and gas major. I'm currently driving our built environment project at TCLP, so I'm really excited to introduce the panelists and our audience to practical free tools that can help MMC stakeholders, SMEs, and all kinds of other organisations to make progress towards net zero. So who or what is TCLP? Well, TCLP is a non-profit, philanthropically funded organisation. As you all know, legal contracts govern the way business is done. Right now, everyone in our audience today, along with their networks and their supply chains, will be bound by certain obligations under certain contracts. And performance of those obligations will likely be producing greenhouse gas emissions in one way or another. As Jessie said at the start, established contract models aren't necessarily suitable for delivering sustainable, innovative MMC. And at TCLP, our aim is to rewire those established contracts so they actually reduce the emissions produced by business. To achieve this, our community of over 2,500 lawyers and industry experts from more than 320 organisations have donated their time to draft ambitious template contract clauses that still perform commercially, but which also deliver on your ambitious climate goals. We can all imagine what the invoice for those thousands of lawyer and consultant hours would add up to, but their output is free for you to take from our website to adapt and start using in your contracts today with no commitment wall or registration required. We currently have over 115 clauses, a glossary of over 50 climate-related terms, and a net zero toolkit to educate and upskill yourselves, your staff, and your friends. Our clauses are ambitious and they don't mirror current market standards, so some are easier for lawyers to integrate than others, but they do reflect what contracts will look like in the near future if parties are to realistically hit their climate goals. So it's a good way to start thinking about those innovative ways of contracting, particularly in MMC, and to sort of get ahead of the game when it comes to meeting your net zero targets through your contracts. And the first question you might ask is, why do we use contracts to fight climate change? The best solution to a lot of climate issues is, of course, legislation. But at TCLP, we take the view that legislation, though it's powerful in the long run, is actually too slow to adapt to meet ambitious net zero targets quickly enough to avoid the alarming future set out in the IPCC's recent reports. Contracts, on the other hand, are bespoke and comparatively nimble documents which can be changed quickly, implemented quickly, and enforced using the normal means of contractual enforcement that lawyers and contract managers are used to. A company with a commercial goal has long been able to encourage its stakeholders to help it realize that goal by making it part of their contractual relationship. We just need to start applying that existing framework to climate-related targets. So to save your legal and your contract team's time in identifying these provisions to reduce your emissions and to solidify the supplier relationships, which, as Alan touched upon, are so important in MMC context, we have more than 30 buildings and land clauses published free to all on our website, and these offer climate solutions for the construction, property, environment, and planning industries. We have clauses covering all stages of the built asset lifecycle, from financing through to materials and contractor procurement, renewable energy supply to on-site, and anti-slavery provisions, sustainable on-site working practices and waste management, and of course, modern methods of construction. Many of the clauses include offset, termination, or cascade mechanisms to incentivize the parties and to give your climate commitments some teeth through your contracts. And that's really important if the parties are actually going to make tangible progress against their targets. Some of our clauses are designed for use with industry standard form agreements like FIDIC and JCT, and can be used to amend the standard forms, as Rayanne touched upon earlier. We're currently consulting with NEC on their new X29 secondary option for carbon reduction projects, which some of you might have seen in the legal press recently. I'd like to explain at this point that all our TCLP clauses also have an alternative title. They're named after a child in the life of the lawyers who drafted the clause, because by contracting with the climate in mind, we're contracting for the next generation. And these clauses are a tangible way to show your climate commitments to your stakeholders in black and white, to sort of operationalize all the buzzwords that are going around at the moment, and to avoid becoming a target of future litigation, and to help secure green finance linked to sustainability KPIs, if that's relevant to you. I thought I'd spotlight one example for you today. Madavi's clause takes sustainable practices and net zero aligned provisions in our other construction clauses and adapts them for the MMC context. It allows contracting parties to embed their vision of sustainability through the use of MMC into contracts, while also achieving the cost and efficiency benefits that MMC offers. At a very high level, the clause requires MMC suppliers or contractors to carry out their contractual obligations in a manner that's aligned with the Paris Agreement goals. We hope that the clause is practical and considers the realities of offsite construction, promoting MMC in a sustainable way for the parties. And we'll include a link to Madavi's clause in the YouTube video, so anyone can access it if they like. It's also available on the TCLP website anytime you'd like to take a look. Now, we know that drafting clauses for MMC is a developing area, so Madavi's clause proposes a strong starting point for drafters, but it will need to be adapted to suit a particular MMC product or solution and the relevant contract in each case. So it's important to have that dialogue with your legal teams and contract managers where relevant. Finally, at TCLP, we have a wealth of free-to-use resources that you can point your legal teams to. As well as our climate clauses, we have a fantastic glossary of net zero defined terms and a net zero toolkit, which includes explainer documents, a short video, and various tools to help your legal teams become fluent with climate concepts. You can listen to our new podcast, Contracts for the Climate, on the TCLP website. There's a snazzy QR code on the screen there that will take you to our podcast webpage. Our first series focuses on the built environment, discusses some of our key real estate and construction clauses. We'd love for you to use this opportunity to deliver impacts in your MMC projects and any element of your business. And there's always, almost always, a TCLP clause that's ready-made or can be easily adapted to suit the contract that you have in mind. There's plenty more information on the TCLP website. You can sign up to our newsletter and attend our events with a network of like-minded cross-sector professionals in the same boat as you. And for guidance, we run a lot of free workshops and clinics that any staff who deal with contracts can sign up for and attend. Most importantly, you can try using our clauses. We have a new clause called David's Clause, which is aimed specifically at SMEs. That's also available on our website. I'm going to include a link to that in the YouTube video too. Once you've tried using our clauses or succeeded, let us write a case study about you to set an example for others in the MMC sector and other SMEs trying to get on their road to net zero too. So that's it from me, a whistle-stop tour of who we are, what we do, and the tools that are available to you. And I'll pass back over to Jessie.
Thanks, Josh. And now we're going to hand over to Surya.
Hello. Thanks, Josh. So I am a managing associate for Untitled. So my specialism is construction, and I sit as part of Untilted's project infrastructure and construction team. When Jessie approached me with this, my topic today is largely focused on climate contracting and how that plugs into the MMC context. So I work quite a lot with the Chancery Lane project, particularly Josh and Phoebe, who are absolutely brilliant. The resource, as Josh has said, is free. I also sit as part of TCLP's Built Environment Advisory Group, and Sarah is also part of it. And it's just a brilliant ability for us as an industry to sort of share information, knowledge, and to push ahead with climate contracting, which is definitely a space that I'm very interested in. At Untitled, we work quite a lot with funders investing in MMC projects. We work with MMC manufacturers, and we particularly also focus very much on developers and SMEs who are looking to incorporate off-site construction or modern methods of construction in their projects. One of the key themes which I have noticed through time is the focus very much on net zero sustainability and also automation increasingly. So this is definitely a big push and direction in which the industry is essentially traveling. Why, for me, why is climate contracting important? And I'm going to digress slightly. So back in the 1960s in Mauna Loa, they started recording emissions or monitoring emissions globally. And this is done on a year-on-year basis in May. So Charles Keeling came up with this measurement back in 1961, and he noticed that above the usual seasonal variations, there was a leveling up, as Boris would say, on general emissions. This was identified very much as something which was being created by human activity. So in this year's most recent recording, we had 420.99 parts per million, which is 50% increase in emissions over sort of the pre-industrial sort of period, 30% more than the 1960s, which is quite mind-boggling. Now, why is this relevant to me and the space in which I work in? It's because the buildings that we work in, we operate, including MMC projects, all of that, everything, the built environment contributes 27% of global emissions. So the context in which that we're all working in is really important because we can actually make a real difference and real change in curtailing and mitigating all of these sort of negative effects of climate change. And so for me personally and professionally, this is a really important space. Related to this, of course, is climate contracting and the work that we have been doing with TCLP and plugging these clauses very much into construction contracts, including coordinating Madhavi's clause, which is named after my daughter, with TCLP, with Josh and Phoebe as well. Why is this important? Because a whole bunch of the Chancery Lane projects provisions, whether it is on energy efficiency, Mary's clause or Tristan's clause, which has to do with use of sustainable materials. And Sarah will touch upon the use of embodied carbon, or rather the measurement of embodied carbon, and the various clauses, such as Luna's clause, which deals with net zero modifications, all of these themes from a contract point of view really build on pre-existing contractual concepts, whether it is JCT, whether it's FIDIC. These are all provisions that a whole bunch of lawyers, not just me or a few others, but a whole bunch of very, very clever people, and I'm going to include myself in that category, have all come up with ways and means to tackle emissions in our built environment. So TCLP's resource, through Madhavi's clause, very much plugs in or gives it that net zero sustainability angle into MMC projects. And you've got a resource which you could very much use in the context of climate contracting. So this is definitely a key area where I think in the next few years, we're going to see increased take up, and I'm sure we will discuss more of this later on in this session. But for now, I'm going to pass it back to Jessie, and I guess it's over to Saya.
Thanks. Thank you very much, all. Very interesting conversation so far. So, hi everyone, my name is Saya Tansel. I work for BRE and I am their offsite construction innovation lead. So those of you who don't know BRE, we sit adjacent to industry and we exist really to develop science-led solutions for built environment challenges. So we do that through research, and we, in the past year or so, maybe a couple of years, we've worked with Bristol Housing Festival and Bristol Council to look at research around the cost of Category 1 delivery, off-site delivery, and optioneering tools for layman personnel, essentially to optimize use of MMC. We look at expert advice and tools and advisory services to enable sort of climate change solutions. So that's very much the common one everyone knows is BREEAM and potentially smart waste, and I'll come on to those in a bit, how they are helping to facilitate both climate change and measurability of carbon to assist. A large part of what we do is around testing, and this is quite an interesting and innovative space really around offsite construction. We're doing a lot of sort of government work around looking at failure mechanisms in that space, and really looking at robustly measuring to sort of level the playing field for offsite, so everything becomes a known. We undertake certification, and that's very much around quality standards and performance for products and portfolios at asset level. And certification is really important for our industry, so that everyone has a solid understanding of minimum benchmark levels. And I am really keen as the offsite lead to develop that space for the offsite industry. And then lastly, we undertake a lot of training. So training around fire safety, but certainly within the offsite and MMC space, it is training around digitized capability to enable that sort of automotive part of stage 5 delivery as such. So I'm going to continue on the theme really around climate change and MMC and talk a little bit about what we've been doing in that space. At higher level, I'd like, we are involved with the built environment carbon database, and that's the most important aspect for consistent measurement of carbon that we will see coming forward in the next couple of years. And once that carbon database is the one source of truth that is in place, the consistency aspect of measurability, I think, will become, will become obsolete as such. That question won't exist. So that's in partnership with RICS, Green Building Council, and a number of other parties. So for us at BRE, we have been using this market intel from our research to help develop our tools for industry. And actually this week, we have just released the Lighthouse version of the new BREEAM platform. And that is a digitized tool, but we are looking at modularizing some of the aspects of that to really help industry to understand what they need to measure around carbon, and also looking at other aspects like EU taxonomy, for instance, which might be more interesting for some of the lawyers on this call. And why I think this tool is really important is because we are looking at releasing in step change to update with the likes of Part Z coming out and the Future Homes Standard. And I say that because I actually think that the current regulatory requirement around carbon doesn't particularly help the offsite industry. You know, the mandatory measurement of energy and use does not pick up or is not sensitive to the benefits that offsite can bring through reduced use of steel and concrete, you know, less transportation, you know, the circular economy aspect and the embodied carbon. Once that gets mandated and there's measurability in that space, you know, we'll be able to have that comparison of why offsite is much better really than a lot of the traditional solutions. So just to highlight some of the modules that will be coming out for within the BREEAM platform, we will be looking at a net zero verification tool, which will identify if buildings are on track to achieve their net zero according to the Paris aligned decarbonisation trajectories. So it will tell you if you're in 2045 or 2030 with your current specification. An exciting one is the scope of 1, 2 and 3 emissions, so really going beyond the building, and BREEAM really looking at the holistic view of carbon measurement, which, you know, will really help the offsite conversation again. And then the EU taxonomy I touched on, and that's sort of more for the investors and financial institutions, will become much more equipped in documenting the criteria for EU taxonomy against their assets. And then last but not least, the one that I think will help the MMC industry the most is our aspirational target of like a whole life carbon measurement within the platform, and that will include embodied and operational emissions from assets to really enable measurement, management and certification across the built assets. And because BREEAM holds a vast amount of third-party information, we will mobilise that to enable comparisons against other portfolios. You really have an insight into how your portfolio or your project is performing against the whole. So yeah, that's where we are at the moment. There's a lot of forward planning there and aspirations, but that's our roadmap, and we really hope it can assist the industry in the next couple of years. So that's it from me. I think Jessie might have frozen potentially, unless she's concentrating particularly hard.
Oh, crikey, yes.
That's okay. Perhaps should we just open up the floor and start discussing between ourselves?
Yeah.
Great. I had one point for Rehan, actually, if no one minds me just jumping in. You said there were perhaps a few holes in JCT contracts that didn't marry up with the realities of MMC and offsite production. I'd love to hear a bit more about how you discovered these and whether you had to cooperate with your legal team to review and sort of suggest solutions to these gaps. It'd be really good to hear about the process. You're on mute, Rehan.
It was working as we delivered Hope Rise. So I think there was some different issues in terms of, you know, it was a first sort of public sector contracts for modular build MMC volumetric with Bristol City Council. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of, you know, led a few different avenues, shall we say. I think one of the key things that we learned was to bring not just procurement, legal teams on board, but procurement as well, because it's across the board and sort of affects, you know, once you get the agreements on the legal side of it and on the contractual side of it and that sort of schedule of amendments, you then got to go back again and bring procurement in, because they're saying, well, this is not how we normally do something. This is very different. You know, why are we paying for stuff that's not on site, and how are those vesting certificates enforceable? And I think one of the other things that we sort of found out was that, you know, the on-site stuff, and so the traditional stuff, foundations, groundwork, is more suitable to valuations, whereas, you know, whether it's fortnightly or monthly valuations, whereas the off-site stuff, is a little bit more interested or involved in sort of stage payments to help sort of that cash flow side of the business. And then how do you bring those together within a JCT? Because you almost got two separate different payment terms there as well. So I think mainly the issues were against how do we get around that vesting, that sort of advanced payment sort of area? How do we enable sort of the without relying too heavily on modular manufacturers to cash flow those initial stages for the things that are off-site, as well as doing the stuff that are on-site, and bringing those two together. And that's really where the focus was.
Rehan, I've got to just add that. So one of the things I do is I do quite a lot of renewable projects as well. So the concepts of offsite, for example, if it's a battery project or a mod, or you're manufacturing a module, there are quite a lot of similarities in the context of, as you would imagine, anything which is factory produced has a slightly different way in which title transfer clauses are dealt with, as well as payment is largely structured around milestones as well. But it's sort of, there are quite a lot of synergies. And I think just as much as MMC is going to have to potentially incorporate renewables as we go ahead into the future, whether it's, we're already doing it, solar panels, battery storage is the next obvious thing, having microgrids, it might just go down that direction anyway. So I think it's just really interesting to see how MMC in some instances is actually well set up to deal with that incorporation of renewables already, just because of the way in which we're already used to structuring payment in this space.
I agree. Just taking on Rianne's point, I mean, Bristol City Council were absolutely fantastic in kind of adapting to the modern methods construction kind of structure, certainly on payment. To tell a client that I think statistically up to 70 to 80% of the money has to be paid up front in the construction sector is heresy in a way. But I do think that there is still a piece of work about how we can get some kind of security over those monies. The insurance market, if we try to bond it, advanced payment bonds, etc., it's becoming more and more expensive. So we're having to ask clients to, pay up front without any security, and I think that's sometimes quite a bitter pill to swallow. It's just the way of the business, I'm afraid. So I think there's a certain element of education needed. I think with clients to think, right, are they willing to pay monies up front, and what's the nature of security that's needed? So I think that is quite a big area. But because, of course, from the manufacturer's point of view, most of the job is finished once it rolls off the factory line. Most of that work is so much upfront work compared to a traditional construction project. So that is a big difference, I think. So yeah, I agree.
Brilliant. That's really, really interesting. And apologies for dropping out just then for that little second. But I think what I can't help but notice as we've been having all of these conversations actually is just the link, and forgive me if this has already been said, but the link between actually the way we're talking about offsite manufacturing in MMC and the way that almost automatically, as soon as we start talking about that, we start to talk about the carbon agenda, low carbon, decarbonisation, the environmental and climate challenges that we're facing. And I think it's a really fascinating thing. And I just wondered if anyone wanted to comment directly on where they see that link and why that link is so important, or why even that link is being made, even without needing a bit of narrative to explain the link. Why is it that MMC and offsite manufacture is such a link into the decarbonisation and the offsite agenda, as it were?
I would say, Jessie, there's twofold sort of reasons. One is the market factors, I think, are definitely a key aspect. So, for example, if you take the energy price increase, and if you are doing a housing project for a housing association or, a local council, you're going to be really keen to keep costs down for your ultimate end users, because you have that not only a environmental agenda, but that social piece as well, which is very much involved, part of that conversation. So I think MMC very much aligns itself into that space really easily. With regards to the actual product, what we're going to see, and this is across the board, until we're able to have a comparable way in which we are able to compare what is net zero generally across the industry, which is what Thea's been talking about, we're going to have innovation. We're going to have take it, whether it's Ilka Homes or Top Hat, they're going to have their own ways in which they're measuring net zero. Of course, there are going to be some comparables in between, but product innovation and the way in which people approach the market, it is going to be quite interesting in this space. And a lot of that is they have correctly read that we need to be doing something with regards to the climate agenda, a climate change sort of risk. And so a lot of the products that they are creating in this MMC space is very easy to align. And, you know, whether it's air circulation, energy efficiency, all of that automatically aligns really well to that net zero space anyway. So it's twofold, both the products, innovation, and the market is driving this as well.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that as well. And I think one of the issues, I think, sort of looking a bit down the line is sort of being at the cutting edge of delivering, you know, zero operational carbon homes and moving and focusing on that net zero, is how do you then get that sort of benchmarking and transparency get across manufacturers, across MMC and traditional build, so that you're ensuring that you've got that level playing field against embodied carbon, against environmental performance, and that everyone who's making those strides forwards to be as low carbon and as energy efficient as possible is being recognised against the leveling playing field with everybody else that's in there as well.
I think that's really interesting. Sorry, go on, Sarah.
I was just going to say, so what I didn't mention was that the next but one iteration of the BREEAM platform will actually be incorporating classification of offsite. So you will be able to understand the benefits which ultimately are the outcome of that system build can be attributed to the type of construction it actually is, which will be really good, you know, data comparison to understand and gives transparency in that space. I also think that the link between offsite and climate change is actually within the delivery aspect of it and de-risking that area. So as our as our climate changes, we'll have really hot summers, really wet winters. It'll be really difficult for us to operate traditionally outside in those types of conditions. And you know, we will hear it about the labour squeeze, essentially, supply chain resilience and productivity in our industry. Offsite is responding to those issues, to you know, through standardization and efficiency to hopefully overcome those before they become too critical for our industry to be able to overcome. So it's sort of this end-to-end process that is a paradigm shift for us, but you know, I think directly links and responds to the issues around climate change.
I see just one further point, which is quite important, is the role of funders in this.
And Alan, did you come in there?
Yes, I was just thinking that I think the Chancery Lane project has a clause that measures carbon, embedded carbon in its products as part of its procurement measurement as well. So not only is it kind of assessing procurement as price, but also how much embedded carbon is being used in that product. So I think, you know, there is that kind of nexus of people considering, you know, embedded carbon not only, as well as price. So I think, you know, the kind of offsite modular factory environment is a much, as Surya has been saying, is a much easier environment to measure carbon and control carbon and come out with a figure, which is quite exciting, I think. I'm not quite sure we're there yet, but you know, it looks really exciting that that's going to happen in the future. So good times. Yeah, I think so. So the difficulty the industry has around carbon is obviously the database. Different LCA tools point to different databases which will have a different value of carbon per product. So once the built environment carbon database comes forward and that becomes the one source of truth, as I said, that will become obsolete. But the other issue is the definitions. There's about 9 of them, I think, which you can use depending on how you want to report. And again, I'm sort of advocating the platform for this because as you put your carbon data in there, it will actually report against all the definitions, so you can have a direct comparison for what you're using as a definition as the outcome of carbon value, which will be quite interesting, I think, to see the differences. And hopefully we will all get to the one in the future.
I think that's really interesting. Forgive me, my Wi-Fi is dropping in and out. Surya, did I cut you off a moment ago? Was there?
It was just me jumping in just to talk about funders as well, Jessie. I was just going to say that part of this space, funding streams, money is going to drive this as well, because a lot of banks and investors, including say Lloyd's, for example, Hodge, they're all looking at this space very seriously. So we are finding in contracts that I'm constantly including provisions, whether it's MMC or non-MMC, say renewable projects, provisions from TCLP's fantastic database, just in the context of due diligence, reporting, carbon footprint measurement, all of that stuff is going into contracts now, because funders need to report to their sort of shareholders or board as well in certain projects. And that is essentially going to be something that we're going to see in this space very much, I think.
This is really good. And so Josh, just sort of coming over to you actually, I'd really, we've had a few sort of questions in and I'm sort of sifting them through as we go, but I just wondered if you could give me a bit of a sense of your opinion on actually the kind of the opportunities and the challenges that we're seeing coming forward, particularly for MMC commissioners. So in the context of this conversation, in the context of kind of contracting and the legal side of this, in the context of how MMC speaks into our climate agenda, actually how are the legal industry, how are they going to lead the way, or at the very least respond or adapt to these changes and these pressures that are coming forward?
Yeah, absolutely happy to talk about that. Thanks, Jessie. And I think the conversation that's been going on about sort of current lack of alignment on standards and reporting and data sharing, any sort of alignment and tools that say has been hinted at that will help SMEs and MMC commissioners with that will be incredibly valuable, and something that lawyers will need to get on board with as well. I think, as we all know, the construction industry is a high emitting sector. It's full of risk for the climate, but also full of opportunities to adapt design and build materials to reduce the emissions that are associated with that, the embodied carbon that Soraya was mentioning earlier. MMC is an excellent example of this. We know, as well as environmental benefits, MMC delivers the cost benefits that we've touched upon earlier. It's quite plausible that these cost benefits might take precedence over the environmental concerns in commercial negotiations. I mean, that's the realities of the business. People want to make a profit. So I think for MMC commissioners and their legal teams, this means that the climate aligned contract terms need to be specifically built into their contracts to ensure that the parties give due regard to these considerations as well as costs. It doesn't get edged out like it perhaps has been in the past. You'd be glad to know we can help with that. At Chancery Lane Project, as well as Madawi's and MC clause, we've got recitals, heads of terms and procurement clauses that Soraya's touched upon. They're relatively low barriers to entry, and they're a really good way to get the conversation started early on. We find the earlier these conversations start happening, the better. There's a knock-on effect, not only for the lawyers, does it make their job easier when it comes down to negotiating the contracts and getting them down on paper, but it really touches upon these long-term relationships that Alan was mentioning earlier. It's especially relevant in the context of MMC, these long-term contractual commitments that commissioners need to make for the supply of very specific materials. There was a recent King's College report that said all the innovations and the efficiencies, the climate benefits that MMC can bring really depends on the strength of those relationships between suppliers and commissioners. They're going to be really important if we want to form this sort of coalition of the willing in the MMC industry. Collaboration is the only way that commissioners are realistically going to get a handle on their scope 3 emissions, which account for a huge chunk of their carbon footprint. As we've mentioned, standardization of things like data collection requirements will be really helpful in a level playing field, as Rianne mentioned too. Perhaps the Part Z future home standard that Sia mentioned will help with that from the top-down perspective when it comes in. But in the meantime, we've got these contractual clauses, the kind of provisions that Soraya has been mentioning, to introduce these concepts from the bottom up and as early as possible in these relationships, sort of at the contract level on the ground. And the MMC commissioners and their legal teams need to adapt, start preparing their clients and their contracts for the future, really.
I think it's really interesting. Sorry, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but I just almost wanted to jump over to Alan for a second, because Josh, you talked about making lawyers' lives easier and making kind of the whole process of everybody's lives easier. And Alan, I know we've had conversations in the past around almost the misconceptions around MMC, and actually some of these things that are perceived to be barriers, particularly in kind of a legal context, that really actually shouldn't be. Maybe they were at one stage, but we've moved beyond that, and yet still the perception is that there are barriers. What are you seeing that people are seeing as barriers that really just don't need to be barriers anymore? And then Surya, I'll come to you after that.
Yes, I think that the first barrier was that because the construction industry is quite a traditional industry, it likes to do what it's always done because it's always done it, and it's to a certain extent worked. And you know, we've all gone through college and we all learn about certain forms of contract, and you know, we don't learn about anything else, as it were. And so we're very traditional in the true sense of the word at the construction industry. And so we know what we like and we like what we know, kind of thing. And all of a sudden MMC has come along and it's going, oh, hang on, this is a bit different. But what we're seeing is that people are learning through, you know, people are, you know, housing associations, etc., are actually adapting and using these new systems. And so the kind of, we're all being educated as we're kind of going along. So what was a kind of barrier of saying, well, we only like what we like, kind of thing. You know, we are seeing great projects which are going forward, and from that people are learning, and you know, we're getting used to a different way of thinking. And if we've got a different way of thinking, we have to adapt our contracts to reflect those different thoughts, as it were. So you know, so that's how we're doing it. So we're now with Surya as well as saying, you know, we are putting clauses in which reflect the way in which people need to reflect in their commercial arrangements in the contracts, and that's what we're doing now, which is fantastic. So we reflect what people want, and people are changing what they want because they're moving away from traditional into more into MMC, which is fantastic. So that's what we're noticing.
I'm just going to sort of put my opinion forward that we should stop using the term barriers around MMC and be thinking about the solutions as enablers, or the barriers as enablers, because there's a problem and MMC is over, or sorry, off-site construction is overcoming it. So that's my thought of the day.
I think it's absolutely essential, because actually whenever there's a challenge, we have the opportunity to innovate and the opportunity to start looking at, or a barrier, we have the opportunity to come up with a new solution to move forward. So I think it's really, I think it'd be definitely a challenge to stop talking about barriers, but it definitely, I think, is a very worthwhile challenge to have made. Thanks, Sarah. Surya, let me come back to you.
If you take Hope's Rise as an example, there was a lot of things that we had to enable to get over. And once we sort of got into that sort of enabling phase and that innovation phase, we weren't just enabling, you know, innovating in the build phase, we were innovating in the procurement phase, we were innovating in the contractual phase, we were innovating in how we do handover, and all of that coming in together, you know, handover user guides and facilities management, and all of that side really need to, you know, we really looked and grasped that with Bristol House Festival, with Bristol City Council, and with and from that contract delivery over to practical completion and handover, really had to, you know, take that apart and put it back together again to make sure we could enable that, and then capture the learnings so it then informs future projects as well and future contracts.
Thanks, Rehan. Surya, come back to you.
Sorry, Jesse, I can't contain my enthusiasm for MMC or net zero. Just a very quick one, really, as a final comment from myself, is just whatever Alan's been talking about, or Josh, I think the key takeaway really from my perspective is MMC is just traditional construction with a twist, and all of the stuff in TCLP's sort of clauses, we're not trying to generate something completely different. It's basically using existing contractual concepts, but embedding into it very strongly the focus that we need we have to tackle other priorities. So whether it is more newer defined terms, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions or carbon equivalent, we just need to come to terms with what the definitions are. But from an actual conceptual basis, it is pretty much the same. We're just adding a twist to it, because all of these clauses have been looked at by so many lawyers. So once again, it's a collaborative exercise across the industry, and which I think is so exciting to be working with the likes of TCLP, Bristol Housing Festival, because this is such a great opportunity to bring people together. That's it. Surya, over and out.
I think that's brilliant. Thank you so much. I think we've only got a few more minutes left, but I think what has been really interesting about this conversation is the way that actually we've set up a conversation around legally MMC, the way that MMC has to engage with the models of our legal contracts and all the rest of that. And we've had such a good, actually robust conversation, and there've been so many good sort of questions coming in, and definitely not enough time to answer them all. But I think what has been fascinating for me is this link between MMC and using MMC, and the link between that and carbon, and how the carbon agenda, lowering carbon, sustainability, ecology, all of those things that are such real and pressing issues for us as a society at the moment. These things seem to just come hand in hand. And I know from other conversations, and part of the kind of the drive of the Bristol Housing Festival is to push forward MMC, not because it is the silver bullet, as I said earlier, but because it opens up an opportunity and is a moment in time where we can start to relook at some of these things. There is so much, this conversation is proof, there is so much work going on around how do we enable MMC, how do we enable it to be used, how do we enable it to be more kind of commonplace, and the work around the legal contracts is only just one part of that. And in that process, we're having to relook at so many other things around how we talk about value, around how we talk about construction practices and diversity in the workforce, for example. There are so many different things, and it has been really encouraging for me to hear all of you talking about in such impassioned terms actually just how MMC links with the climate agenda and links with innovation in so many other ways. I am going to wrap up, and I'm just going to say a final few words, but then I'm going to come to each of you for a sort of 20-second, 30-second takeaway. So if you have a moment, just what's your takeaway from this conversation, or what is it that you would like to just reiterate from this conversation, sort of 20 or 30 seconds. But before I come to each of you for that, I just wanted to say thank you so much to each of you for being part of this conversation. Thank you so much for making this conversation possible. I want to thank our partners at Workforce for the Future for enabling this conversation, and for all the other events that we've had going on. If you are interested in more of the Workforce for the Future program, the YouTubes are all these kind of webinars that we've been hosting are all on our YouTube and all available, and will continue to be available as long as we can make them that. And there are more site visits and other events coming forward over the next few months. So do watch our website for any more information on that. But very briefly, please, everybody, very briefly, I'm going to come to each of you in turn. Your kind of final 20-30 seconds takeaway. We're going to come to Alan first.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I am quite excited that the next generation of contracts will, by default, I think, include, the net zero carbon clauses in MMC, and I think that's a very exciting time for us to be involved in the construction sector. So watch this space, I think.
Thank you, Alan. And Rehan, over to you.
Yeah, just to echo that as well, as someone that's been involved in net zero and zero carbon design for the best part of the last 15 years, we've been pushing forwards, and to see things getting incorporated in the contractual agreements to actually enshrine some of those things in how projects are being delivered in terms of carbon emissions, operational emissions, and embodied carbon is really, really exciting. I think by looking at how the different enablers that we've got in terms of, as the schemes that we're doing are becoming increasingly either larger or more complex, and there's different risks and perceived risks in them, and to sort of look and have these conversations and look and focus on how we're enabling these to go ahead and working on those contract terms, really, it bodes well for the future of MMC and delivering and making big impact on the carbon agenda and the housing crisis.
Thanks so much, Rehan. Josh, over to you.
Thanks, Jesse. I'd just emphasise the point that MMC commissioners, stakeholders and their lawyers need to be building these climate-friendly contract clauses into their contracts today, at least trying it out for the future. Lawyers can no longer advise on any construction matters, whether MMC or otherwise, without touching upon climate risks and the opportunities. In the current world where we've said MMC is so interwoven with decarbonisation, it'd be like operating in a vacuum. When legal teams and stakeholders are ready to tackle that, we're here to help at the starting points to evolve the contracts, increase the ambition over time, and to reinforce those long-term relationships that, as we've said, are so important to MMC.
Thanks, Josh. Surya, let me come to you.
I was just going to say climate contracting, MMC climate contracting is very much a real thing, and it's a necessary thing. So I just urge everyone to collaborate and speak to each other, because the industry needs to be moving in that direction.
Brilliant. And finally, Saya.
Yeah, to echo everybody else, really, Surya said about collaboration there. It's been great to be introduced into this group who are so forward thinking, really, and that collaboration between ourselves, industry and contracts, which really is the backbone of how we should be delivering project. projects is you know, it's inspirational but absolutely necessary for us to move forward in a considered way, so that everybody knows where they are, all of the outcomes are considered, and that ultimately will enable the mainstream adoption of offsite, we hope.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone that's watching for being part of this and for engaging, whether you're watching live or you're watching on repeat. But thank you also so much to my panelists. This has been a really interesting session. Thank you.